The vessel arrived on a Tuesday, not with a distress call, not with weapons hot or shields raised. It simply drifted into the approach corridor of way station Kestrel 9 at a speed that suggested it had not made a navigational decision in some time, as if the ship had not so much chosen a destination as stopped resisting momentum. The approach monitors registered it at 0317 station time. The automated traffic systems flagged it as anomalous within 4 seconds. No transponder ping, no hailing frequency, no standard approach vector. The duty officer on the overnight shift, a 23-year-old named Carr, who had been awake for 11 hours and was on his third stimulant T, almost filed it as sensor drift. Almost. What stopped him was the hull configuration. He had done his orientation training like every other new Kestrel 9 crew member. He had sat through the xenological briefings with their long species catalogues and their dense taxonomies of spacecraft design. He remembered almost none of it, but he remembered the Vathani. You remembered the Vathani because their ships looked like nothing else in the catalogue galaxy. Long asymmetric structures wrapped in a material that was simultaneously metallic and translucent, with irregular protrusions that caught light in ways that seemed geometrically impossible. Vathani vessels looked less like starships and more like very large, slow-moving thoughts. The ship in the approach corridor was Vathani. Carr did not file it as sensor drift. He called his director. His director called the station administrator. And the station administrator, a broad-shouldered man named Obasi Tunda, who had been running Kestrel 9 for 6 years and had in that time encountered precisely 0 Vathani in any context whatsoever, called the only person on the station he trusted to handle something that made no sense. He called Marin Solis. Kestrel 9 occupied a position in space that its own crew sometimes described without affection as between everything and nothing. It was not a major transit hub. It was not a military installation or a diplomatic waypoint. It processed about 40 ships per standard month, mostly human traders, a scattering of Turvani freight haulers, the occasional Bresci science vessel passing through on a survey run. It had 4 repair bays, a population of 112, a cafeteria that served 2 hot meals per day, and a maintenance department that operated under a budget that Marin Solis described, privately and repeatedly, as aggressively optimistic. Marin had been running maintenance at Kestrel 9 for 3 years. Before that, she had been a trauma surgeon at a colonial hospital on a planet called Durea's Landing, which had 3 times the population its infrastructure was designed to support, and a medical system that ran, as she once wrote in a letter she never sent, on good intentions and the assumption that something would go right eventually. She had been good at the work, genuinely good. The kind of surgeon who did not panic, who could operate in failing light with inadequate instruments, who had developed over 11 years of practice an almost uncanny ability to sense when a patient was about to go wrong before the monitors registered it. She had left medicine after a year that she did not discuss. Engineering, she had told Obasi when she applied, was easier. Things either worked or they didn't. You didn't have to watch. This assessment, as Kestrel 9's experience would eventually demonstrate to the entire galactic community, was not entirely accurate. Marin arrived at the approach bay in her work clothes at 0341, still carrying the tablet she had been reading when Obasi called. She looked at the ship on the exterior monitors for a long moment without speaking. When did it stop accelerating, she asked. Carey checked his logs. About 6 hours ago, based on trajectory. So it's been drifting for 6 hours. Yes, and the crew hasn't hailed us. No. Are they alive? The biosensors, when directed at the hull, returned a faint positive. Something inside the ship was metabolically active. Whether it was distressed was harder to determine. The Vathani operated in a physiological range that human sensors read poorly, and the ship's own systems seemed to be running at minimum capacity. Marin studied the vessel. Even damaged, or whatever it was arresting to look at. The translucent outer material caught the ambient light of local space and held it in patterns that shifted slowly, like breath. Send a contact ping, she said. Standard frequency, polite. The ping went out. There was silence for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then a response came, not on the hailing channel, but on a frequency that the communications array had to search briefly to locate, a register so low it was more felt than heard. A listener. The translation system rendered it, after a pause that suggested it was not entirely confident. We require a listener, not a mechanic. Marin looked at Carr. Carr looked at Marin. Tell them, she said slowly, that we will try. The Elivos, which was the name Marin would later learn, a Vathani word that translated approximately as the one that carries what remains, docked in Bay 2 at 0529. The docking was managed almost entirely by the ship's automated systems. Whatever was wrong, the vessel still knew how to park. Captain Seravath emerged alone. Marin had read what she could find on the Vathani in the 90 minutes between the hailing ping and the docking. It was not much. They were ancient, among the oldest spacefaring species in the catalogued regions. Their biology was based on silicate crystalline structures rather than carbon, which meant they aged in geological terms, with some individuals approaching 8 centuries. They communicated through a combination of spoken resonant tones and subtle vibration patterns that human sensory equipment could detect but rarely interpret fully. Their ships were considered by those who studied such things to be among the most sophisticated vessels in known space. What she had not read anywhere because no one had written it, or if they had, the writing was not in any archive accessible to Kestrel 9, was why a Vathani captain would bring a failing ship to a human way station of middling reputation located at an intersection of trade routes that even its own crew found unremarkable. Seravath stood in the docking bay with a stillness that Marin associated with very old things. The crystalline structures of his skin caught the overhead lights and scattered them in faint prismatic patterns across the floor. His eyes, if they were eyes, 2 deep structures set wide in his face that seemed to perceive differently depending on the angle, settled on Marin with an attention she felt more than saw. He did not offer a greeting in any form she recognized. He simply looked at her for a long moment, and then said, in a voice that the station's translation system rendered with unusual care, "You were something else before this." It was not a question. Marin kept her expression neutral. "What does your ship need, Captain?" "That," Seravath said, "is a more complicated question than you understand yet." The technical inspection of the Iliavos began at 0800, when Marin had managed 2 hours of sleep and a meal, and had assembled her lead technician, Pressa Covain, along with 2 others from the maintenance team. What the diagnostic equipment showed them was, professionally speaking, nothing. Or rather, nothing actionable. The propulsion systems were operating at reduced efficiency, but within tolerable range. The navigation array showed minor calibration drift. The life support was stable. The structural integrity was within acceptable parameters. By every standard metric, the Iliavos was a ship that was underperforming modestly and could be returned to full function with routine maintenance. And yet, Pressa noticed it first, because Pressa was the kind of technician who noticed things that were not quite in her instruments. She had been running a routine conductivity sweep on the ship's secondary systems when she stopped and held very still for a moment, in the way she did when something was wrong. "It changed," she said. "What changed?" Marin asked. "The reading." Pressa showed her the scanner. "When I stepped closer, the conductivity shifted. Not much, but it shifted. Could be thermal differential. Your body heat. I thought that." Pressa stepped back. The reading shifted again, fractionally, in the opposite direction. She stepped closer. It shifted back. "It's not thermal. It's responding to presence." Marin took the scanner and ran the test herself. Pressa was right. The Iliavos was not simply malfunctioning. Something in its systems was actively, if subtly, responding to the presence of beings in its interior. She went to find Captain Seravath. There was a moment, about 8 months into her 3rd year at Duria's Landing, when Marin had been working a long shift in the trauma ward and had encountered a patient who was by every clinical measure stable, vitals reasonable, no acute injury, no acute infection. The monitors showed a person who should have been recovering. The patient was not recovering. Marin had sat with her for 20 minutes, which was 20 minutes she could not afford to spend, and had eventually understood that what she was looking at was not a clinical problem. It was a person who had decided in some quiet interior place to stop, not in a dramatic way, just to stop trying, to let the current carry her where it would. The intervention that had worked in the end was not pharmaceutical or surgical. It was conversational. It was Marin sitting in a chair and asking the patient to tell her about something she loved, something specific, something real, and then listening to the answer with her full attention, which was harder than any procedure she had trained for. She had never fully understood why this worked. She had a set of theories, drawn from the psychological and neurological literature about connection and agency and the body's response to felt recognition. But the honest answer was that she did not entirely know. She only knew that it did. She thought about this as she walked toward Captain Seravath's position near the forward observation port. "The ship responds to presence," she told him. "Not to instruments, to beings moving through it." Seravath was quiet for a time that felt longer than it was. When he spoke, the translation system worked harder than usual. The lag slightly extended. "The Iliavos has carried crew for 231 of your years," he said. "In that time it has learned the resonance of 11 crews, their patterns, their rhythms. Their particular weight in space. He paused. The most recent crew served for 40 years. They were lost 18 months ago. A navigational failure in a dense matter region. There were no survivors. Marin said nothing. Our vessels, Seravath continued, are not constructed in the way you build things. They are grown. The material from which they are made, we call it Velhari, has properties that are not fully mechanical. Over time, in contact with the resonance patterns of living beings, it develops something. Not consciousness, not exactly, but a form of attunement. The ship learns what its crew is, and when the crew is gone, it remembers, Seravath said. And it grieves, in the only way it is capable of. The Iliavos, Marin was beginning to understand, was not malfunctioning. It was in mourning. Pressa Covain, later that week, while the expanded maintenance team was mapping the Iliavos's systems, told the story that she would eventually repeat to the coalition hearing. The story that, in Marin's estimation, explained the entire situation more plainly than any technical documentation could. 3 months before the Iliavos arrived, Pressa had been working on a heating coil in the station's secondary dormitory block. The coil had been failing intermittently for weeks. Every time she replaced the faulty component, it would run for a few days, and then fail again in the same way. She had tried 3 different replacement parts, checked the connections twice, run diagnostic sequences that confirmed everything was in order. I was ready to tear the whole section out, she said. Complete overhaul. I actually had the parts requisitioned. And then I was sitting in the corridor outside the housing unit, eating lunch, and one of the long-term residents, this old woman named Sabat, who had been living in the unit for 4 years, walks past and pats the wall, just pats it, like you'd pat a dog, and says to it, "I know you're tired," and then walks on. Pressa had watched this, and then because she was the kind of technician who followed unlikely things to their conclusions, she had gone back into the housing unit and run her diagnostics again, and had found something she had missed 3 times before. The coil was not faulty. The coil was operating correctly. The problem was that the surrounding mounting structure had micro-compressed from years of thermal cycling, and it was placing an uneven load on the coil every time temperatures dropped. The coil was not broken. It was exhausted. The fix took 20 minutes and cost nothing. What I learned, Pressa said, is that when something keeps failing in the same way, after you've replaced the obvious part, the problem isn't the part, it's what's around the part. What the part has been living with. The Iliavos had not malfunctioned. It had been living with loss. Marin's approach to the Iliavos was not in any technical manual. She did not have a technical manual for this. She was working from a different library entirely. What she understood from her years in trauma medicine was that a system under grief was not the same as a system under damage. Damage required replacement, correction, structural intervention. Grief required something else. Something that was harder to name and considerably harder to justify in a maintenance budget report. It required what she privately called witnessed patience, the act of being present, consistently, without urgency, while something found its way back to itself. She redesigned the maintenance schedule. Instead of running invasive diagnostic sweeps, the team would work in quiet proximity to the Iliavos's systems, maintaining contact without forcing correction. They would run gentle recalibration passes, not to override what the ship was doing, but to create conditions in which the Velhari material could re-establish its baseline rhythms. They would be, as Marin explained to a deeply skeptical Obasi Tunde, less like mechanics and more like she searched for the word hospice workers, present, patient, not trying to fix, trying to accompany. Obasi stared at her for a very long time. "You want to treat the ship like a grieving patient," he said. "I want to treat it like what it is," she said, "which is a system that lost something important, and hasn't found a way through yet. And you think this will work?" Marin considered this. "I think it worked in medicine often enough that I don't know a better option, and I think if we try to force conventional repairs on a system that is responding to Velhari grief, we will make it worse. The instruments would look better. The underlying condition would deteriorate." Obasi was quiet. Then he said, "How long?" "I don't know," she said. "That's the part I can't schedule." It took 11 days. 11 days of quiet presence, of gentle calibration without correction, of Marin's team moving through the Iliavos with the careful attention of people who understood they were guests in something's grief. There were setbacks. 3 days in, the ship's power distribution dropped sharply, and Marin had to make the decision not to intervene, to let it find its floor and begin climbing on its own, which was the hardest professional call she had made since leaving medicine. The floor held at 42% for 18 hours, and then, gradually, began to rise. Captain Seravath spent most of those 11 days aboard his ship. He did not interfere. He did not offer technical guidance. He moved through the corridors in his geological stillness, and occasionally Maren would pass him in a hallway, and he would look at her in that way he had, as if observing something the instruments weren't catching, and say nothing, and she would say nothing, and they would both continue. On the morning of the 12th day, Pressa ran a full system sweep, and then stood in the middle of the primary engineering section, and did not move for a long time. Then she called Maren. The Ilia Voss was operating at 94% of baseline, not because they had replaced anything, not because they had forced a correction, because they had in some way that none of their diagnostic systems could fully account for, given it the conditions it needed to grieve its way through to the other side. Seravath, when informed, was quiet for longer than usual. When he finally spoke, the translation system flagged 3 words as uncertain, concepts for which there was no precise human equivalent. It rendered them approximately as, "It has accepted the continuing." The Ilia Voss had not forgotten its lost crew. It never would, but it had found a way to carry the memory without being stopped by it. Maren watched the power readings for a long time. She felt something she had felt occasionally in medicine, in the aftermath of a patient making it through something that had seemed unsurvivable. It was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It was something that felt mostly like relief. The Ilia Voss departed Kestrel 9 on the 14th day. Captain Seravath, before boarding, found Maren in the maintenance office. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the crystalline structures of his skin scattering light across the desk, the walls, her hands, and then said with unusual directness, "What you did was not in our technical literature." "No," Maren agreed. "It is in ours," he said. "Or it was once, before we became very good at building and lost the practice of listening." He paused. "I will tell others." He left. The Ilia Voss cleared the departure corridor without incident, its systems running cleanly, its resonance patterns according to Pressa's readings, which she had learned to interpret over 11 days of attention, carrying something that, if the senses were to be trusted, felt recognizably like purpose. Maren filed her maintenance report. She described the process in technical language as best she could. She noted the unusual nature of the engagement. She listed under materials used a total cost that was lower than any repair job she had completed in 3 years at Kestrel 9. Then she went to bed. She slept better than she had in a long time. The first follow-up vessel arrived 6 weeks later, then 2 more within the month. By the end of the 3rd month following the Ilia Voss departure, Kestrel 9 had received 9 Vethani ships in various stages of what Maren had begun calling, carefully in internal documentation only, resonance distress. The pattern was consistent. Every vessel had experienced crew loss or prolonged operational isolation. Every vessel showed instruments that read acceptable, while something underneath the acceptable readings was failing, in ways no standard diagnostic could name. Every vessel responded, over time and with patience, to the approach Maren's team had developed. The method was not reproducible in the way that technical procedures are reproducible. It required, Pressa once explained to a researcher who had come to observe, the same kind of attention you'd give something you were trying to understand rather than fix. If you go in with a conclusion, the ship feels it. I know how that sounds, but it's what we've found. Archivist Duan arrived with the 5th ship. He was Vethani, older than Seravath by what Maren estimated was at least 2 centuries, and his role was not that of a ship captain. He was, as best he could translate his function for the Kestrel 9 record system, a keeper of old knowledge. He had come, he explained, because what was happening at this small human way station was something the Vethani archives had records for, from a very long time ago, and he believed those records were relevant. He also believed, he added, with the careful precision of someone who had spent centuries being accurate, that those records had been deliberately obscured. Maren listened to Duan for 3 hours in the station conference room, with Obasi present, and Pressa taking notes. What Duan described was this: the phenomenon of resonance memory in grown vessels, what he called the Velhari attunement, had been documented by Vethani scientists approximately 4,000 years ago. The documentation was thorough. It described the grief response in failing ships, the conditions under which it occurred, and the methods by which the response could be addressed. These methods were not mechanical. They were, in the ancient terminology, relational. They required sustained presence, witnessed patience, and a willingness to sit with a system's distress, rather than override it. For approximately 2,000 years, this knowledge had been active in Vethani ship maintenance. Vessels had longer operational lifespans. They recovered from losses. They aged, Duan said, the way very old people age, accumulating rather than deteriorating. And then the consortium of architects had risen to prominence. The consortium was not originally Vethani.
It was a multi-species guild of the galaxy's master shipbuilders, who had over the past 2,000 years consolidated nearly all design, construction, and maintenance authority for advanced vessels across dozens of species. They were extraordinarily skilled. Their ships were technical masterworks. Their maintenance protocols were precise, efficient, and completely standardized. They were also, as Marin began to understand, built on a foundational assumption that Duan said quietly and without apparent anger, that a ship was a machine, that it could be understood entirely through its specifications, that anything which could not be measured by an instrument did not need to be accounted for. The Velhari attunement, the resonance memory, was not measurable by standard instruments. Therefore, in the consortium's technical literature, it did not appear. This was, Duan said, not entirely an oversight. There is documentation, he said, that the consortium's founding technical committee was presented with the ancient literature, that they reviewed it, and that they determined officially, in a recorded decision, that the relational maintenance model was non-scalable and economically inconsistent with standardized service protocols. The room was quiet. They knew, Obasi said. They knew, Duan confirmed. And they chose not to integrate the knowledge, because the knowledge was not compatible with their business model. Standardized maintenance, replacement of parts on schedule, certification of all service by consortium-affiliated facilities, planned intervals at which vessels return for factory servicing, was not only technically effective by most measures, it was, economically, a perpetual system. Ships that could be guided through grief, that recovered and strengthened over decades of relational maintenance, did not need factory servicing on a standard schedule. They did not need parts replaced that had not failed. They were, in the long term, self-sustaining. This was not compatible with the consortium's business model. The ancient knowledge had not been destroyed. It had been quietly, formally, definitively classified as historical curiosity, not applicable to current standards. 4,000 years of ships had been maintained as machines, and some of them, many of them, had failed not because they were broken, but because no one had known to listen. The consortium of architects sent Commissioner Halveth to Kestrel 9 7 weeks after Duan's arrival. Halveth was a Bressi, a species that Marin knew mainly from the occasional science vessels that passed through. Bressi were compact, precise, and deeply invested in correct procedure, which made Halveth a natural representative for the consortium. He arrived with 2 aides and a dense packet of legal documentation referencing the vessel sovereignty codes, the maintenance certification accords, and 17 subsections of the Galactic Alliance technical standards. He was not threatening. He was genuinely concerned. The Velhari material, he told Marin in their first meeting, with the tone of someone explaining a safety hazard, is extraordinarily sensitive. Unauthorized interaction with Velhari systems carries documented risks of cascade failure. Your team is working on these vessels without certification, without understanding of the fundamental material science, and without liability coverage. You are endangering crews. The ships that come to us, Marin said, come because they are already failing under standard maintenance. The standard maintenance protocols are designed by specialists with thousands of years of expertise. The standard maintenance protocols, Marin said carefully, do not account for resonance memory. Halveth's expression shifted, fractionally. That is not a recognized technical category. It is in the ancient Vathani literature. Archivist Dune can provide documentation. There was a pause. Historical documentation is not equivalent to current technical standards. Perhaps, Marin said, the question worth asking is why the standards changed. That meeting ended politely and resolved nothing. What it produced, 3 weeks later, was a formal notice from the consortium. Kestrel 9's engagement with Velhari vessels was in violation of the maintenance certification accords, and the station would face sanctions unless all work on advanced alien vessels ceased immediately. Obasi received the notice on a Wednesday afternoon and called Marin into his office, and set it on the desk between them and said nothing for a while. How many ships are currently waiting? Marin asked. 14, he said, and a request from 4 more in transit. What happens to them if we stop? Obasi looked at the notice. They go back to standard maintenance facilities, which won't help them, or they don't go anywhere, and they keep declining. Marin was quiet for a long moment. We need allies, she said. Obasi sent communications to every Vathani captain whose vessel Kestrel 9 had worked with. He also sent, on Marin's request, a communication to Captain Saravath, specifically. The response rate was higher than either of them expected, and faster. Within 10 days, 9 Vathani vessels had indicated their intention to appear at Kestrel 9 in support. 3 more arrived unannounced, having apparently learned through some communication channel that Marin's team did not have access to. The Independent Operators Network, the web of small traders, survey crews, and intersystem haulers, who had no particular affiliation with the consortium, responded to the situation with the energy of people who recognized a pattern they had encountered before. Several filed formal complaints with the Galactic Alliance Council about the consortium's monopoly on advanced vessel maintenance. A delegation of smaller independent worlds, many of which ran their own maintenance facilities under constant pressure from the consortium's certification requirements, submitted a joint statement in support of Kestrel 9's operational freedom. The Galactic Alliance Council, an ancient and slow-moving body whose relationship with urgency was, charitably, complicated, agreed to convene a hearing. Given the number of parties involved and the range of interests, they chose to hold the hearing at Kestrel 9 itself, a decision that surprised everyone, including Kestrel 9. The station, which had a maximum comfortable occupancy of approximately 120, spent 2 weeks preparing for an event that would bring 430 representatives, observers, captains, and archivists to its facilities. Pressa organized the logistics, with the focused intensity she brought to mechanical problems that had defeated everyone else. Marin mostly stayed in Bay 2, and continued working.
The hearing opened at 0900 on a morning when the star that Kestrel 9 orbited was at a particular angle that filled the observation windows with warm light. Marin, who noticed light, noticed this. Commissioner Halveth presented the consortium's case first. He was meticulous, thorough, and made 3 points that were genuinely difficult to counter. That unauthorized work on Velhari material carried real risks, that human engineers had no formal training in Vethany vessel systems, and that the consortium's maintenance protocols had supported galactic shipping infrastructure for 2,000 years without systemic failure. All 3 points were true. Marin noted them. Then the Vethany captains testified, ship by ship, crew by crew. The record of what had happened at Kestrel 9 was placed into the hearing record. Ships that had been declining under standard maintenance for years. Ships that had recovered here, not through replacement or correction, but through something that the captains described in terms that made several of the consortium's technical observers visibly uncomfortable, because the terms were not mechanical, they were relational. The ships had been witnessed. The ships had been accompanied. The ships had been given the conditions they needed to find their way through grief. Archivist Dune presented the ancient documentation. He did so with the measured precision of a being who had spent centuries learning that the most powerful arguments were the ones that simply laid out the evidence and allowed the evidence to speak. He presented the original Velhari attunement studies. He presented the records of relational maintenance practices from 4,000 years ago. And then he presented the consortium's founding committee records, the minutes of the meeting at which the ancient knowledge had been reviewed and deliberately set aside. The chamber was quiet during this presentation in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. Halveth, to his credit, did not pretend the documents did not exist. He argued carefully that the decision had been made in good faith, that relational maintenance was genuinely non-scalable, that it required a level of individual attention that could not be applied across thousands of vessels, and that the standardized protocols had preserved countless ships that would otherwise have been lost. This was also, Marin acknowledged privately, probably true in part. Then Elder Morvas was given the floor. Morvas was the oldest Vethani captain currently in active service. He was, by Doan's estimate, 714 years of age, which placed his birth in an era before the consortium existed, before the ancient knowledge had been classified, before the last generation of shipbuilders who had understood what Velhari truly was. He moved slowly. His crystalline structures were deeper in color than Serevath's, richer, the kind of depth that comes from centuries of accumulated light. He took his position at the center of the chamber and stood there for a moment before speaking, and the chamber's quiet deepened in response to his presence in a way that was hard to account for, technically, but was felt by every being in the room. His ship, he said, had been in service for 400 years. He had captained it for 312. It had been in declining function for 40 years. 40 years of consortium-certified maintenance, standardized replacement cycles, precise technical interventions that addressed every instrument reading and left the underlying condition untouched. He had been told, at 4 different consortium facilities over those 40 years, that his ship was within operational parameters. He had been told this by technicians who were competent and thorough, and who were looking at instruments that showed numbers in acceptable ranges. He had known, every one of those 40 years, that something was wrong, that the instruments weren't measuring. His ship had lost a crew to a stellar event 308 years ago. It had carried the resonance of that loss, alone and unacknowledged, for 3 centuries. Because no one at any facility it had visited had known to look for something the instruments could not show. He had brought it to Kestrel 9 6 months ago, after Captain Serevath's communication had reached him. He had been skeptical. He was 700 years old. He had learned to be skeptical of easy solutions. The work had taken 3 weeks. He had stayed aboard throughout. He had watched a team of human engineers move through his ship with the attention of people who were trying to understand rather than fix, who were comfortable with not knowing, who had, and here Elder Morvas paused for a long moment, and the translation system flagged the next phrase as carrying emotional weight it could not fully render, who had not been afraid of what the ship was carrying. When he spoke again, there was a quality in his resonance that the translation system described, uncertainly, as weeping in a register not audible to most present. 300 years, he said. My ship carried that alone for 300 years. Because we had forgotten how to listen. Because the machines we built to measure it could not find it. Because the protocols we follow, which are efficient and correct and defensible, do not account for what a vessel remembers. He was quiet for a moment. I am 714 years old, he said. I have seen many things. I have rarely been surprised. These humans surprised me. Not with technology, not with knowledge they should not have possessed. They surprised me with the oldest thing there is, the willingness to sit with something in its pain, and wait without flinching. He returned to his seat. The chamber remained quiet for a very long time. Commissioner Halveth abstained from the final vote. He did not explain this publicly. In a brief exchange with Marin afterward, he said only, "The old documentation was in the consortium archives. I did not know it. I should have known it." He paused. What Elder Morvas described, 300 years, that is a failure of our protocols. I cannot vote to defend a system that produced that outcome. He left without further comment. Marin watched him go, and understood that he was a person who had built his professional life on the belief that the system he represented was genuinely good for the vessels it served, and had just discovered evidence that complicated that belief significantly. She knew what it felt like to discover that something you had trusted completely was more limited than you had understood. She did not call after him. Some things needed to be processed in private. The Galactic Alliance Council's ruling was delivered 8 days after the hearing concluded. It established effective immediately the right of any vessel owner to seek maintenance from any facility willing and able to provide it, regardless of consortium certification. It mandated the declassification of the ancient Vethani Velhari attunement literature and its integration into the technical standards library of the Alliance. It required the consortium of architects to commission an independent review of all current maintenance protocols against the newly available historical research. And it established at Kestrel 9 what it called the Resonance Recovery Institute, a facility dedicated to the study and practice of relational vessel maintenance, open to practitioners from all species willing to learn, funded jointly by the Alliance, and by a remarkable number of voluntary contributions from the Independent Captains Network. Marin was named its founding director, a role she accepted with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had applied for a maintenance job, and found herself some years later heading a galactic institute. Obasi took her out for coffee to celebrate. He did not say much. He raised his cup in her direction, and she raised hers back, and that was sufficient. 1 year later, Marin stood in the observation corridor above Bay 2, the bay where the Iliavos had first docked, and watched the morning's training session. 12 students were working in the bay below. They represented 7 species. 4 were human, 2 were Vethani, 1 was Bressi. Pressa had not believed this until she had met the student in question, a young Bressi named Aveth, who had apparently come to the institute specifically because of what Commissioner Halveth had told him after returning from the hearing. The others were from species that Marin was still learning to read, whose body language and physiological tells and methods of attention. She studied the way she had once studied clinical presentations, with focused curiosity and the comfort of someone who had made peace with not knowing everything immediately. The ship in Bay 2 was a mid-size Vethani freighter, whose crew had experienced significant losses during a navigational emergency. Its systems were in the early stages of resonance distress, caught early enough that the process would take days rather than weeks. The students were moving through the ship with the attention that Marin had spent a year trying to teach, unhurried, genuinely curious, comfortable in the presence of something that could not yet be measured but needed to be witnessed. Pressa was running the session. She had become in the past year a teacher of unusual quality. Her explanations were concrete and grounded. She did not mystify the process. She described it always in the most practical terms she could find. A system in distress responds to presence. You cannot force it through. You accompany it, you create conditions, you pay attention to what it does, rather than to what you expect it to do. Captain Seravath was standing against the far wall of the bay, watching. He had joined the Institute 3 months after the ruling, in a capacity that did not have a precise title, observer, consultant, living archive were all accurate in different ways. He moved through the facility with his geological patience and occasionally offered guidance, and was particularly valued by the Vithani students, who found in him something that Marin did not entirely understand but recognized as important, a being who had lived long enough to carry the old knowledge in lived memory rather than in text. Marin was still watching when she heard footsteps in the corridor and turned to find Duan approaching. He had been at the Institute since its founding, cataloging the ancient literature and overseeing its integration into the new curriculum. His pace had slowed somewhat over the past year. He was, Marin had learned, approaching his 820th year, and while this placed him in the moderate middle age of Vithani life expectancy, it was not without its accumulated weight. "How is the morning session going?" he asked, settling beside her at the observation window. "Well," Marin said, "Oveth has good hands, better than good attention." Duan looked down at the bay. "In the old literature," he said, "there is a phrase. It appears in the earliest Velhari documentation, before the knowledge was formalized, when it was still being understood for the first time. The phrase translates imprecisely, roughly. The ships do not need us to fix them, they need us to find them." He was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about this phrase for 4,000 years of archived material. I believe I understand it correctly now, having watched your team work." Marin looked at the students below. Pressa was showing Oveth something on a scanner reading, and Oveth was nodding, and then doing what Pressa had taught all of them to do when the scanner showed something unexpected, setting it down, using the other kind of attention. "What I have wondered," Duan continued, "is why humans understand this instinctively. Your species has no history with Velhari material. You had no literature on resonance memory, and yet your first instinct, when presented with a ship that instruments could not explain, was to try to listen." Marin thought about Duaya's landing, about 11 years of working with systems that could not always be measured, with patients whose distress was real and present and not always legible to instruments, about the particular education of being a person whose training had been in understanding things that were alive, who had then spent years learning that most of the machines she worked with were more alive than their specifications suggested. "We had practice," she said. "A long time before we had spaceships, we had things that broke in ways the instruments couldn't find, and we had to figure out how to sit with that, how to keep working when you don't know, how to be useful to something without fully understanding it." She paused. "I think we learned that early. I think it got into how we approach problems." Duan was quiet. Below, the training session continued. Hands moving, attention held, a ship beginning, slowly and in its own time to find its way back. "In 4,000 years of records," Duan said finally, "I have encountered many accounts of one species learning from another. Knowledge transferred, techniques adopted, understanding expanded. It is the mechanism by which civilizations grow." He paused. "But I have encountered very few accounts of one species teaching another how to grieve well, how to stay present in the face of loss and keep working." He looked at Marin. "This is what Kestrel 9 has offered. I suspect it is rarer than technical knowledge, and I suspect it will prove over time to matter more." Marin did not respond immediately. She was not a person who responded immediately to things that required sitting with. After a while she said, "I left medicine because I was afraid of what it cost to feel things that couldn't be fixed. I thought engineering would be simpler." She watched a student below carefully adjust his position relative to a Velhari panel, the way Pressa had taught, not touching, just present. "Turns out I was wrong about that. Most useful discoveries begin that way," Duan said. The Iliovos returned to Kestrel 9 on the 340th day of the Institute's operation. Captain Seravath had not announced the visit in advance. The ship simply appeared in the approach corridor one morning, and the monitoring systems flagged it, and Marin happened to be in the control room when the flag came up. She watched it dock on the exterior monitors. Its hull caught the ambient light in the same shifting breathing patterns she remembered from the first morning, 2 years ago, when she had stood in this same room and tried to understand what she was looking at. The systems were running cleanly. The resonance patterns, which the Institute had spent a year developing better tools to read, showed a ship that was, in Press's terminology, carrying forward, still holding what it had lost, but moving with it rather than being stopped by it. Seravath found Marin in the maintenance office, the same office where they had first spoken, where she had tried to explain an unconventional approach to an ancient captain, and had not been certain she believed it herself. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "We are on our way to a new survey run," he said. "I wish to see the Institute." "You've seen it before," Marin said. "I wish to see it again," he said. "It is the kind of thing one wishes to see more than once." He stayed for 2 days. He attended a training session. He spoke with the Vithani students for a long time, in resonance tones that Marin could feel in her chest but could not understand, and when he was done the students were quiet in the way people are quiet when something important has been said. He walked through Bay 2 where the Iliavos sat resting, and placed one hand against the hull for a long moment, the first time Marin had seen him make that gesture, and then removed it and turned and was ready to leave. At the departure lock he stopped. In Vithani, he said, there is a concept for a being who teaches not through knowledge but through example of attention, who demonstrates by how they engage with the world that it is possible to be present with difficulty without being destroyed by it. He considered for a moment. It is an honored role. We had thought it was extinct. He left. The Iliavos cleared the departure corridor and disappeared into the dark, carrying its old grief and its recovered purpose, heading somewhere new. Marin stood at the observation window for a while. Below, in Bay 2, a new group of students was beginning their first session with a vessel that had come a very long way to find someone who knew how to listen. They moved carefully, with the unhurried attention of people who had been taught that the most important instrument was not in their hands. Outside the window, the stars were doing what stars do, burning, steady and patient, across distances that made most human concerns seem small and most human acts of care seem somehow larger. If you've stayed this far, stories like this take a long time to find and longer to tell. If this one stayed with you, consider keeping the station running. Next time, a signal arrives from a ship that has been missing for 80 years. Its logs are intact, its crew is not, and what it recorded in the dark, no one expected.